It took me about 2 years of actual writing to write Acid Test, but it really was 40 years in the making. I didn't really realize until I fully started working on this book, what a long and incredible history psychedelic therapy had. We see all the time little articles, dribs and drabs of what's going on, but I don't think you can really fully grasp it or fully feel its significance unless it's all put together in an encyclopedic way. And so that's what I tried to do in Acid Test, is tell the story of psychedelics from the invention of LSD in the 40s right up to today. And I not only wanted to tell the story, I wanted to tell it through the people that were instrumental in it. And it's amazing how a small group of people can go all the way back to the beginning, and you can trace a direct line from there to where we are now. And so I felt that if people understood the people behind it, the thinking, the experiences, the conditions that psychedelic therapy is used to treat, that the facts speak for themselves. You don't have to proselytize. You don't have to argue, really. If you just inform people as to the full perspective, it's really clear what the significance is. This is one of the original Acid Test posters. This was for Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, had these LSD happenings on the West Coast in the 60s. I'm 60 years old, and I kind of became aware of psychedelics through this period and through this kind of thing. And that's me in 1975. And I was a college student, as you can see from the t-shirt, at the University of Florida. And I had, through this influence that was going on in the culture, just like a lot of other people my age, I had some psychedelic experiences. University of Florida is in the middle of Florida in Gainesville. Nice warm weather year-round. Lots of cow pastures outside the university. And the cows eat a lot of grass, and they process this grass, and they make deposits in the cow pastures. And in those deposits grow psilocybin mushrooms. So we would go out around campus and pluck these out and either boil them up into tea and drink it or just pop them into our mouths. From the beginning, I kind of had this idea that this was not a frivolous entertainment. I was really searching. I really was looking for something, for the sort of deeper meaning of the world and to understand myself better. And I found over time that it really paid off in astounding ways. I took some mushrooms one time, and as it was taking effect, I began to obsess over these anxieties and problems in my life. And they kept building up and getting bigger and bigger. And some of them were about what I was going to do that evening, and others were about what I was going to do in 20 years. And I suddenly just felt consumed by all this worry and anxiety. I kind of had this vision that was very real. That's one of the things about the psychedelic experience, is that you aren't just having a cerebral experience. You're really feeling it. It's three-dimensional. It's actual. And so I had this vision of an actual boulder that was pressing down on me, this huge weight of all this concern and anxiety. And then I could barely breathe. It was so heavy. And then suddenly I saw something very interesting about this boulder, which was the reason it was pressing down on me was I was holding it to myself. I was, with great effort, holding this boulder of concern, and that all I had to do was relax my arms and the boulder would just fall away. And so I did, and it just vanished. And that entire weighty boulder of concern and anxiety just vanished. And that stayed with me. I mean, I left college, I got a job, I got a career, I got a family. Psychedelics were still illegal. I felt it was irresponsible to risk that. I stopped doing them, but I didn't stop thinking about that insight. I thought about it pretty much every day of my life. I couldn't just instantly let go of negative feelings like that. But because of that experience, I knew that it was possible. And because I knew it was possible, I was able to work on the ability to just release negative feelings and watch them vanish. And, I'm to a certain extent, I got pretty good at it. And it made a huge difference in my life, maybe all the difference. And I realized when I started writing this book that there was a whole community of people who had lived responsible, high-achieving lives, who had had similar experiences, and they had never forgotten the significance of positive psychedelic experiences. When I started doing this book, my biggest problem was I couldn't get people to easily talk about it because these were people in positions of responsibility and authority, and they were afraid that if they said something positive about psychedelics, then that would have bad consequences for them. But fortunately, they got brave, and they got brave enough to talk to me, and that allowed me to tell this complete story. It started back in 1975. I lived in Sarasota, Florida, and I was home on break from college, and I was the editor of the college newspaper, and I came across an article in the local paper, just a little blurb, about this sort of wild man hippie who was building this fantastic house in the woods just east of Sarasota. And so I decided that there was something very, excuse the expression, trippy in all that. It was clear from the subcontext that what he was doing was expressing values that he'd learned in his psychedelic experiences, trying to do it in concrete. And so he was building this really fantastic house with this fantastic stained glass window that he had commissioned. And he was really doing it on his own. And so I went and I wrote this story, and it appeared on the cover of the college Sunday supplement. And his name was Rick Doblin. And that was it. I just thought he was an interesting guy. I had a great conversation with him. 10 years later, it was 1985, and I was the editor of the Miami Herald Sunday magazine, Tropic. And I came across an article in Tampa Tribune about this perennial college student / college dropout who was going around proselytizing that this new drug, MDMA, was the answer to psychotherapy of the future. And as I was reading the article, I saw something a little familiar, the name Rick Doblin. And I thought, oh my God, that's the hippie in the woods, that's the same guy. And so I assigned a reporter to go out. We did this story, and the inside headline was, "A Tim Leary for the 80s." This was on the eve where everybody knew that it was going to become illegal any day. So once again, I went about my business, and about 15 or so years later, I was the editor of the Washington Post magazine. And I saw a little blurb in the New York Times, and it said that Harvard was doing the first psychedelic research it had done since it rode Tim Leary out on a rail. And I was looking at the article, and maybe in the third or fourth paragraph, it said it was sponsored by an organization called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which I always like to say is the most boring possible name with the word psychedelics in it. And which was, I think, on purpose. And the head of this organization was the hippie in the woods, same guy. And I said, I cannot believe this. I am definitely, I'm going to do a article. This time I'm going to do it myself. That was me in 2007. And that was Rick. The passage of time is a really awesome thing, isn't it? So I called Rick that day. I couldn't believe it. Not only did he remember who I was, he said he had both those articles sitting on his desk in front of him as we spoke on the phone. And the reason of that was that he had just shown them to his board of directors. And his point was that he had come so far in his image from being this sort of wild man Tim Leary character to being, the man behind research at one of the first psychedelic research at one of the premier institutes of research in the country. It turned out his attitude about how he was regarded was, a little bit optimistic, and Rick has always been optimistic because McLean Hospital at Harvard that was doing that research got a new president, and the new president looked at, MAPS is the sponsor, and basically was saying, we don't want anything to do with this, psychedelic advocacy stuff. So the MAPS had to like fund the funding through some donor directly to Harvard. And even so, the research never recovered. But there was another project going on at the same time. A psychiatrist named Michael Mithoefer down in Charleston, South Carolina, had teamed up with Rick and MAPS to do the first ever clinical study of MDMA ever since it was illegal in 1985. They had struggled for 15 years and overcome unbelievable obstacles against all odds, and nobody thought he could do it. But he finally got the FDA approval to do it in 2000. And the study was ongoing, and it was a study to use MDMA-assisted therapy to treat women mostly who had been victims of rape and sexual abuse. So I went down there and I interviewed these women, and I was, I knew that I had had that experience myself, and so I knew there was something of value. But what I wasn't prepared for was that the healing power that this demonstrated in people who had severe and chronic PTSD, really life-threatening PTSD, because a lot of these people felt that they would have no choice but suicide if they couldn't find some relief. And this was treatment resistant. They tried everything that was out there for post-traumatic stress disorder without finding any relief. And then they'd have 2 or 3 sessions, and according to the diagnostic test, they were cured. You take penicillin, you have an infection, and the infection goes away. There's no conscious awareness. Your body's just doing it on its own, and you're not aware of it. But the healing here was taking place on a conscious level. It was all about the awareness. People would suddenly have these tremendous insights that allowed them to look at these things that caused these traumatic events that caused their stress, and to see them in a completely different way, in a way that they could actually integrate into their personality without this fear reaction that was causing their symptoms. And it was incredibly dramatic, and so I published this article. I wanted to write a book. I knew then that I did. But I also knew that there would be resistance in mainstream publishing to this idea. And I also saw that they were planning to do a study on veterans who were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with combat trauma and PTSD related to that. I decided that what I needed to do was wait for that to happen, and then wait until their pro forma allowed them to actually, they had to wait like a year to even ask these subjects whether they'd be willing to talk to a journalist. And then I had to find a subject who was courageous enough to, because I knew that what I needed was someone who was going to just completely be transparent and let people see everything that they went through that gave them PTSD, what the PTSD did to them, and everything that happened during the therapy. Who could be more vulnerable than someone whose life was threatened by this terrible condition and who submitted themselves to bearing their soul under the influence of a psychedelic drug, and to have all that visible to the entire world. And I knew that was going to take some extraordinary courage. And that's when I found Nicholas Blackston. The book really is a story of how these 3 lives came together, and I'm talking about Rick Doblin, Michael Mithoefer, and Nicholas Blackston, and how Rick got where he was from being this sort of outrageous acid head, basically, to really taking on the establishment and establishing a scientific basis for the efficacy of this. And Michael Mithoefer, who started out as a kind of rebel and ended up being an emergency room doctor who got sick of treating the end result of psychic pathology in the form of stab wounds and suicide attempts in the emergency room, and wanted to get in on the end where these pathologies were caused to begin with, and to have more of a collaborative process with his patients. And he had a really fascinating journey that involved like going to Peru and studying with a shaman and doing ayahuasca and doing breath work with Stan Grof, which is, Stan Grof is the person who's done more psychedelic therapy than any human being alive. And when it became illegal, he realized that the real healing was in alternative, in the altered state of consciousness, that was where the healing came. It wasn't really the drug that was healing you. It was the altered state that the drug provoked. And so he tried to produce that altered state with something legal, which was this breath work, which was basically hyperventilation and loud music, to some really dramatic effects. And Michael and Rick both studied with him. And then Michael just said, some people don't succeed with breath work. And he felt like it was malpractice to know that there were these compounds out there that could provoke this healing state for people who desperately needed it. But no, he couldn't even mention it. It was irresponsible to even suggest it. So he and Rick teamed up and ended up with this research. And that's where Nick came in. He was, I'll let him tell the story, but he was basically at the end of his rope when he saw and noticed that this therapy was ongoing.
Right after high school, I joined the Marine Corps in 2004. I did 2 combat deployments to Iraq. My first one was to Faluja, and my second one was to Ramadi. And in Ramadi, I saw a lot of terrifying and horrific things that you would see in war. I watched my friends burn alive. I myself was, my vehicle was attacked by an enemy RPG, and I took shrapnel to my butt and legs. And my driver, good friend, Seabass, died during that attack. And literally, day in and day out in Ramadi, it's constant firefights and continuous bombardment by the enemy. It wasn't any one particular event that attributed to my PTSD. It was a continuous thing being there. So whenever I got back home, I was still in the Marine Corps, and it was about 6 months later I started noticing some of the symptoms. I started having nightmares, and I was very hypervigilant, which I was always on alert, always thinking that someone was going to come out of somewhere and attack me, and I'd have to be engaged in some kind of firefight. And I suffered from depression, anxiety, panic attacks. I really felt hopeless because the medicine I was receiving from the VA was on Seroquel and Zoloft, and they just made me feel like a zombie. It just pushed down a lot of the stuff and the symptoms. Didn't really get at the core. So I was looking for alternative therapy, and once I got out of the Marine Corps, I got back with the VA, and I was doing treatment with them, and it wasn't working, so I got out of that and looked online, and I found MAPS, and I got into their, luckily, I got into their research. The therapy, it saved my life. I regained the hope and purpose that I needed. The biggest thing was I realized that I took a part of myself that I thought was evil and bad, that Marine Corps side of me that did what he did in Iraq, and I pushed him down. And in my very first MDMA session, I had this vision where I went to myself, and it was this Marine Corps self with red eyes and demonic face and torn camis and just chained to the wall. And I went forward and opened up that door and said, I'm sorry for putting you here, and if you want to tear me apart, I understand. The eyes went back to normal, and it's like we became one, and I set up from the therapy. So while you're in the therapy, you have like eye shades on and music, and your Michael and Annie Mithover were both there. I woke up and told them what I'd seen, and it was something that occurred in my mind, a vision, but I felt it all over, and I realized that I was cutting myself off from the rest of society. Like a puzzle piece, when you break off a chunk of it, there's no way it's going to fit to the other puzzle pieces, and I realized that I needed that part of myself, and I was able to take the things that I learned from the Marine Corps, the discipline, and facilitate it in my everyday life. And after I got done with the therapy in 2012, I continued to practice the techniques, especially the breathing techniques and the things that I personally learned, and it helped me to where I am today. I have a wife, and she's pregnant, and I'm about to have thank you. I'm about to have a child soon, and I finally feel like I have my head together to where I could be a father. I didn't want my child to see me the way I was before. And I'm so grateful for this therapy, and I really wouldn't be alive and I wouldn't be here today. I honestly wouldn't be able to stand in front of all you people. I'd have a panic attack quite fast. So it really has revolutionized my life and changed me.
Pushing the book. Checks in the mail. It can't be comfortable to have all that in the book. But the reason Nick did it was because he was a Marine, and Marines really believe you don't leave your comrades on the battlefield wounded. And yet that's what he feels like he's done, because here he was able to get this therapy in a trial of just 24 people, when as many as 500,000 Iraq and Afghan veterans have come home with severe and chronic PTSD. And though that's something that through their disability payments and their health care, and the health care for someone with PTSD is enormous because there are all these sort of side effect things that happen to them, you know, alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, et cetera, is going to cost the government $1 trillion over the next 30 years. The government hasn't spent one dime on furthering this research, which objectively, if you look at it, I mean, you can easily make the case that it is the most promising PTSD research out there. We were on the NPR Diane Rehm show a couple of weeks ago, and I had asked somebody from the Pentagon to come there and represent the Pentagon's view. And I did this through, you know, contacts that I had, insiders. And the message that came back through the intermediary was from a general who said, oh no, this is way too dangerous for folks in uniform. And I'm thinking, talking about a treatment for PTSD is too dangerous? And you send young men, 19, 20 years old, into combat, and you're worried about talking about a possible cure? I mean, it really, I mean, I still get a nauseous feeling in the pit of my, what's courageous is what Nick has done by talking about it.
How many times did you take the MDMA? And then what was the follow-up therapy?
There'd be a few weeks before, and it was just talk therapy, I was talking to Michael and Annie, and they were getting me ready for what I was going to experience with the MDMA, and also talking about my past and what I went through and everything. You'd have those 2 weeks, and then on the third time you would actually have the MDMA. Total, I had 6 sessions of MDMA. Because the way it was a double-blind study at first, and they didn't know what I was getting, what dosage. And if I was getting the low or medium dose, I had the option to stay in and try the full dose. So I did 3 sessions with the 75 milligrams, and then 125 milligrams, 3 more sessions like that. And you know, while I had found, I guess, the healing I needed in my very first session, every other session after that just seemed to add more and more to it, and it went beyond Iraq, and it went down to my childhood, and it was just a big diving into the subconscious world, and it's too much information to really explain, but they have, the setting was an office, but it was like a house. Sunlight could come in and everything, so it was a very beautiful setting. And Michael and Annie, especially under the influence of the drug, they felt like they were my parents. So I just felt real comfortable just talking to them. And a lot of it was I would lay down and put eye shades on and then put headphones on. And, the music would be like Native American chanting music and stuff, and it would really help me to, I guess, disappear from the outside world and go inward. And I would have these visions and insights that were just profound. I mean, information was just coming to me continuously. So,
yeah, I'd like to add one thing to that in terms of the follow-up. Nick's condition was really challenged. 2 years, he did great for 2 years, and it wasn't like life was smooth. I mean, he had to negotiate returning to civilian life and getting a job and dealing with work. And you know, there was this one thing that I recount in the book that I love was that he went for a job interview, and they kept asking him about, you know, what his experience were in dealing with customers. And he says, from now on, whenever you say dealing with customers, can I assume that to mean dealing with the Iraqi people? Because I assumed that those were the customers I was serving. But anyway, 2 years later, just through unbelievably cruel coincidence, there was a horrible automobile accident. 2 cars hitting head on, body parts scattered on the highway, right at Nick's front door. Literally, he hears this gigantic crash, thinks maybe he's hallucinating again, and walks out and sees this unbelievable scene of carnage, which, if you know what he went through in Iraq, it's the last, even you would just think that's the last thing. And so that was very challenging to him. And because of the strict pro forma of the research, there was no way that he could go in for another session. It was just, I mean, at that point, hey, MDMA is still illegal. It's only through it's only through this research that's allowed, and it's only allowed in the context of the research. But fortunately, Nick had sort of learned enough in his sessions 2 years earlier that he was able to get through that.
Have you had the opportunity to share your experiences from the therapy with peers, with other veterans that have come back, perhaps that have PTSD? And what has been kind of the response from that?
I have quite a few friends who are still in, and some of them who've gotten out of the military, and they all suffer still. And it's hard. You kind of have that survivor's guilt. You just want them to have that same healing, and it's obviously, not available to them. And I share my story with them, and they're very hopeful about it. But it's still hard to communicate with them when they're talking about their problems. Sometimes you don't want to talk like I'm okay, I'm fine, and everything. It really is hard to be the one who's been healed, and all your brothers and sisters. All your brothers and sisters are still suffering.
Are there any therapy studies going on for people with autism using altered states?
There's one ongoing now, and you can find out the details about it on the MAPS website. I mean, there were one of the things MDMA had been used for before it became illegal was to help people with autism. So they had some good results, not in formal studies, and now they've embarked on the first formal study of it, and it's ongoing. It's really an amazing website. It's one of the most effective websites I've ever seen. It tells you it's a huge resource.
I served in the Israeli military in the mid-90s and experienced not too different experiences than what you have. Part of what I've been dealing with is the guilt, not only of what I, trained soldiers to do and what I experienced myself. I also switched places with some friends last minute, and all of them died. How did you prepare before the experience with psychedelics?
Michael and Annie really were there to help me to breathe through my experiences and everything. When you're talking about the switching places, my job was the machine gunner on top of the turret of the Humvee. And so it's my responsibility to take out the enemy before they take out us. My friend dying, I really felt that was my fault, that he died. Somehow, I realized through the study, through the MDMA, it really helped me, I guess, take myself out of the picture and get a bigger picture of why things, I guess, happen in this world the way they do. And it wasn't my fault that he died. It was a bigger picture, I guess you'd say. So I can understand what you feel about when I have switching places and stuff. In my very first deployment, my good friend, he's still alive, but he took a 155 shell that was buried under the road and blew up, and it caved in his forehead. And that most likely would have been where I was at if I didn't get switched to a different platoon at the time. So, but I really didn't have anything, I guess, to prepare myself before it besides just those talk sessions that I had before the MDMA with Michael and Annie. I went ahead and told them a lot about my story and everything. So when it came time for the therapy, they were aware of my story, and when I would maybe mention something about Iraq, they say, well, do you think this might be a time to really go in and really think about that? Or do you think this might be a time to go ahead and put the eye shades on, earphones on, lay back down? And the drug really helps, facilitate these forgiving experiences. It really takes away the fear too, because you know how you don't want to talk about it at all. A lot of vets are like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. If they're afraid of this reacting or maybe having a panic attack or outburst in public. And the MDMA lowers the fear. And so if you don't have the fear, you really do feel a lot more comfortable talking about it and bringing it up.
And it was important. Michael and Annie played a really key role in this. Nick allowed me to watch his therapy sessions they videotaped the whole thing. And there was a moment where Nick was getting upset because he came to the realization that he thought of himself as a murderer for the situations where these kids, maybe 12 or 13 years old, came at him with AK-47s blasting, and he's up on his .50 caliber, and so he had to do what he was trained to do. And yet, he never really forgave himself for that, and he says, I'm a murderer. And Michael said, you were a soldier, you were in war, you were protecting your friends, you were doing what you were trained to do, you're not a murderer. Nick has a tattoo on his torso of his dog tags. The dog tag, and the reason they do that is because if they get blown apart so that they can identify the body, and they call them meat tags. And so Michael said, yeah. He says, they put your dog tags on your body. They call them meat tags. And you go out there and you can't, and they're putting you in this impossible situation. And so that kind of guidance as the MDMA is making possible that he's even confronting this, and to realize that this is the way he thought of him, it's really important to have that kind of guidance with you. That's why this is, MDMA-assisted therapy. It's not just the MDMA alone, it's the combination of the MDMA and the therapy as well.
I'm curious, in your experience, what you have found to be the most valid resistance to supporting research, and what you have found to be the best counter-argument.
There is no valid reason to resist research. I mean, the research produces the science, and then you evaluate the science on its own merits. There is absolutely no valid reason to resist doing the science, and that's what's been going on ever since the late 60s and early 70s. I think that the best counter-argument is the careful research that's being done, up to all the standards of modern medical research, and it's going to make its case. I think you always have to speak carefully, and people do when you're talking about these small phase 2 trials, 24 people, 36 people, whatever. And they usually say, well, you prove that there's reason to evaluate it, but it's really the big studies with hundreds of people, et cetera, that over, many dozens of locations that can prove that it's effective in a large group. But this is a unique case because this is a case that had 10 to 15 to even close to 20 years of practice where thousands of people underwent this in the 50s and 60s. It's almost been completely forgotten. But this was, in Canada, the government of Canada said that the use of psychedelic therapy to treat alcohol addiction was no longer an experimental treatment, it was a proven treatment. And this was in 1960. So basically, what this cultural hysteria has done is it's delayed things by 30 or more years. It kills me to think about where we could have been. And of course, the draconian placement of all these psychedelics on the most restrictive possible legal category managed to shut down research entirely. But as we all know, it did almost nothing to stop illicit use. So, it's just been insane, and we're just now getting back on track. But the tragedy is that at the rate they're going, where MAPS, has to raise the money itself without any government help. The phase 3 trials, they cost tens of millions of dollars. And nobody's going to make money on this because, you can't patent these psychedelics. And because the treatment isn't like a lifetime maintenance like it is for a lot of these psychiatric drugs. You do the therapy for a handful of times, you're done. You're better. And so nobody's going to make a fortune off of these things. So it makes it, so it's going to take, Rick, in his optimism, is hoping it will be less than 10 years. But everything has taken much, much longer than people at first anticipate. And what a tragedy if this doesn't become a prescription therapy for another 15 years. It just boggles my mind to even consider that. So, what we can hope is that as awareness of the potential here becomes more widespread, and as the good science behind it becomes more known, that the stigma will finally release, and perhaps a new generation of leaders will help this along and make this happen as soon as possible. The FDA has the ability to fast-track an urgently needed drug. They could do that if they wanted to, and I can't think of a treatment that's more urgently needed.
If you were able to speak to healers, people facilitating ayahuasca ceremonies or other psychedelic therapies in the underground in the United States, what advice would you give them for working with people that are suffering from military-induced PTSD?
There is now a really developed body of knowledge about how to be effective in this kind of therapy. And in fact, online, you can get Dr. Midhofer's treatment manual for use with the MDMA, which has a general application to, I would think, all psychedelic therapy. So what I would say is make sure that you do the research. There are resources available, and not just that, but other places too. As I said, this kind of therapy has been ongoing since the 1950s, and Stan Grof's books. So educate yourself, because this is not something to play around with. People's lives are at stake.
Is research into MDMA-assisted therapy only proving its efficacy and making it legal, or is there research into developing it further, into sort of refining some kind of technique?
There's lots of research going on. There's research into, and every time that they do a trial, they refine the technique and they study it. I mean, one of the things they're doing is they're studying tapes of these sessions and trying to find a system to objectify results and to note the points where, where difference can be made. So they're refining the technique. They're also doing research with functional magnetic resonance imaging that observes the brain, what the brain is actually doing in these sessions. So they're trying to understand what's going on in the brain and how that relates to its effects on the patient. So yeah, I mean, research is exploding in all sorts of different directions.
To what extent is there an opportunity to do the research in countries where it's legal, and so do it on a larger scale?
The achievement of Rick and MAPS and others is that it is legal to do the research now here. They've established this. Getting the proposals through the FDA is much easier than it was at the beginning. So you can do the research can be done here. And of course, there are places where clinical practice is legal. Like in Brazil, Ibogaine is legal, and they're using that to treat drug addiction. And that's just one example. So yes, there are places where it's actually legal to do the clinical practice. And again, that's something, that I said the MAPS website is a terrific resource for understanding. They have a thing on what all the laws are everywhere in the world on psychedelics.
Excellent. Well, please give a round of applause to these wonderful gentlemen. Thank you so much.